I'm Marge Battle. Welcome to this week's edition of Education and Perspectives from Medgar College of the City University of New York. Where can you see some of the most interesting and provocative television around? Right here on Education and Perspectives. So stay tuned for today's exciting segment.
Medgar College is a place to grow, a place to establish lifelong friendships. Medgar College is a place full of history, with struggle, with meaning. It is a place where you can be your best. It is a place that you can call home. To learn more about Medgar College and how it can assist you in building a brighter future, contact us by phone or by website. We look forward to welcoming you to the Medgar family.
Welcome to another edition of Sankofa Review. I'm your host, Crawford. Today, my very special guests include Professor Ronoko Rashidi and Dr. Bruce Bynum. Welcome to you both, brothers.
Thank you very much.
Brother Ronoko, would you introduce yourself to my audience, please?
I'm a lecturer, a writer, research specialist. I have a couple of books, one, African Classical Civilizations and the African Presence in Asia. My primary interest is in African migrations, where African people have gone and what they're doing.
Okay. Dr. Bynum?
I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm currently the Director of Behavioral Medicine and Biofeedback at the University of Massachusetts Health Services in Amherst. I'm primarily a training therapist, and I am a bread and butter doctor. I see patients day in, day out, and I'm also a writer. And one of my areas of interest is certainly in consciousness, particularly the deep African consciousness that pervades the consciousness of all peoples. I also have an interest in dreams and family work, and the actual clinical work I do is in individual therapy, of course, but also in hypnosis and psychosomatic medicine.
Okay, Brother Rashidi, why don't you set the framework in which this conversation will take place? Could you give us a sort of overview of the dispersal of Nile Valley cultures into Asia, from the western part and then way on into Southeastern Asia?
Well, let me talk a little bit about the African migrations in general, including those emanating from the Nile Valley.
Okay.
Excuse me, I always like to say that you need to look at three broad waves of movements. One is that humanity began in Africa, and that African people began to wander at a very early stage on an international journey. That's number one, so that if you're looking at Asia, you're looking at African people as black people as the first people in Asia. And then I've always thought that it's not enough just to be able to say that you were first, but it's more important to be able to say what you did.
Okay.
And here we're talking about not what African people lost, but what African people contributed to the world. And so that in Asia, you can also look at the role that African people have played in the development of classical civilizations, urbanization, agricultural science, writing system, metallurgy, and what have you, whether it be in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley among the people called the Sumerians, or whether it be in the Indus Valley, and going as far as in the Yangtze Valley in China, and into Southeast Asia. And then, of course, you have Africans who were captured in Africa and enslaved and dispersed over the world in Asia. And you have a notable example in Iraq. In fact, in Iraq, I think from the 7th to the 9th century, you have three major slave insurrections, the biggest of which, from 868 to 883, is called the Revolt of the Blacks. And then in India, of course, you have people commonly called Siddhis, and sometimes Habshis. These are black people, Africans who became Muslims, who converted to Islam, and in many cases achieved high status, including a brother named Malik Ambar, who became a king in what is now the West Indian state of Gujarat.
Okay. I know that your particular interest, among a number of other interests that you have, lies in the Indus Valley civilization. Could you talk to us quickly about those two high cultures, those two high civilizations, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, quickly?
Well, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa are probably the two major centers of what is called the Indus Valley civilization. In fact, Harappa is so significant that it is sometimes simply referred to, the whole civilization is referred to as the Harappan civilization.
Yep.
Very ancient. I'd say it goes back to at least 5,000 BC, and it covered an area larger in size than both Egypt of the pharaohs and the Sumerian civilization of the Tigris-Euphrates put together.
Right.
In fact, when we talk about the Indus Valley civilization, you're talking about a civilization that extended into Afghanistan, modern Afghanistan, and deep into India itself. In fact, in western India, you have a place called Lothal, Lothal, which is supposed to be the place where the first artificial dock was created. And this was a part of the Indus Valley or Harappan civilization. And it also indicates the widespread trade networks that developed there. You have a people who had a high culture, had cities characterized by, among other things, hot and cold running water, flushing toilets, trash chutes,
Paved streets, walls, so forth, so forth.
Obviously, advanced city planning.
Right.
Standard and uniform weights and measures. I think the real extent of the civilization has yet to be explored. And one of the reasons for that is because the writing system, what's sometimes called the Indus Valley script, has not really been effectively deciphered. And so this is one of the challenges ahead of us.
I want to bring Dr. Bynum into this conversation now. And as you could well appreciate that when cultures disperse and when migration takes place, they do not only take the technologies, but they take their social systems, they take their moral values, they take their religion, they take a number of things, right? In your work, the African Unconscious, we can peruse all of this very complex and very precise information that you've given to us. But what I want you to address for us, especially in this area that Brother Ronoko just referred to as Indus Valley civilization, the dispersal of what is usually called meditative yoga form, the Kundalini. I know people in this audience must have heard this word. Could you explain to us what is the Kundalini?
The Kundalini is a worldwide phenomenon. It's rooted in the physical human body, and it is also the root, the source, the area around which many religious and psycho-spiritual traditions have flourished. And it's usually represented as a serpent, or called the serpent power. If you look at the medical caduceus, used in the West, is a representation of that, of two serpents coiled around at various points. That image in particular comes out of ancient Kemetic Egypt, and then later appears in the Greek and Roman systems, but its origin is in ancient Egypt. Well, that phenomenon that represents is called the Kundalini phenomenon. Kundalini is the system, the name given to the system in India. And in ancient Egypt, it was referred to as the Uraeus serpent. And what it refers to is a series of disciplines, psycho-spiritual and physiological disciplines, to awaken, guide, and eventually prepare for the full unfoldment of that evolutionary force in human beings that leads from a state of relative quiescence and to one in which one is particularly completely awake, not only psychologically, but spiritually. And that system you can find in its earliest expressions worked out in the laboratories of the Nile Valley, and then spreads through the trade routes to the civilizations of India.
Okay, but Ronoko, the Ankh. The Ankh is one of the most potent and one of the most well-known symbols coming out of Nile Valley. And somehow there is a connection, not somehow, because I know, Dr. Bynum, you're going to explain for us the correlation between the Ankh and the Kundalini. But Ronoko, talk about the Ankh for us, please.
Well, as I understand it, the Ankh is an ancient African symbol, Nile Valley symbol that expresses, I think it's sometimes called the key of life. And it has been explained to me as a symbol of the unity or union of the male and female union. Dr. Bynum, perhaps you'd want to expand on that
Well,
a bit
it's
more.
certainly the union of the male and female in that state of integration that is recognized to be one associated with spiritual reality, spiritual awakening. Really, the Ankh actually is termed the sap of life in many of the ancient Kemetic Egyptian texts. And what it refers to is that, remember we were talking earlier about the medical caduceus, that image, that symbol? At the base of that, when that energy is awakened through various psychospiritual disciplines, meditation being one, and there are different forms of meditation. In the West African tradition, that includes movement, particularly movement of the lower back and spine, and movement of the feet. Many different disciplines to awaken and entrain that energy that is has a physical expression. When it goes through those particular channels and reaches the top of the head, quote unquote, the ori in West African traditions, the male principle that is awake in all people and the female principle that is awake in all people is united in the brain core. The Ankh is a literal projection or representation, a physiognomic projection of when that energy has ascended into the brain core and circulates through certain ventricles, particularly the third ventricle of the brain, sending out particular vibrations or acoustic plane waves that interact with the heart's acoustic plane waves, and sending out vibrations through the head. It creates in the brain core magnetic fields. Okay, and these magnetic fields, when a person is in a particular fully realized state, if you want to speak of it that way, entrain with other energetic fields that surround and infuse the earth, geomagnetic fields.
All right. Now, it brings to mind another symbol that's it's used quite popularly. It was used in the 60s, and now it has resurfaced. The yin and the yang. Ronoko.
You're asking me questions that Dr.
No,
Bynum.
let's deal with China.
All right.
Let's deal with China and tell us something about the African presence in China.
Well, you have an African presence everywhere.
Okay.
In fact, if you look, somebody said this fellow Godfrey Higgins, who wrote a book called Anacalypsis, published in 1836, and that book was kind of a cornerstone work for many of us.
Right.
He said, I found something black whenever I approach the origins of nations and religions. And China is no exception to that.
Right.
You find, according to archaeological evidence, black people at the root of Chinese culture, or the Chinese populations is a better way to express it. About a year and a half ago, there was a big report about how most Chinese today, or most people in China, genetically are directly linked to Africa. But certainly during the historical periods, particularly the Shang dynasty, the Shang dynasty
Even before
being
the Shang, pre-dynastic dynasty. Right.
But the Shang dynasty is a formative dynasty in China, begins, I think, around 1750 BC. You have many of the artifacts show clear and distinct African characteristics, an Africoid phenotype. And there's an expression that is connected to the Shang, actually attributed to the culture that came after them, the Zhou, that describes the Shang and says they had black and oily skin. And certainly in some of my slides and in some of the photographs in the book, The African Presence in Asia, we show Africoid types among the Shang. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that the Shang were black people, but just like the Sumerians in Western Asia and the Tigris-Euphrates, certainly among the higher echelons in society, you definitely have a black elite. And I think that's very important. If we say that these cultures were black, then we kind of put ourselves in a corner.
Right.
But if we say that among the higher echelons in these societies, in these cultures, you have a powerful African element, I don't think you can get away from that.
Yeah. Dr. Bynum, Ma'at, which is the major foundational principle upon which Nile Valley cultures were found. And one of the precepts of Ma'at is balance. Now, when you talk about the synthesis of these two energies, and we look at Chinese culture, we see this yin and yang. Would you want to explore that a little for us?
Generally, the yin and yang that's seen in Chinese culture as a symbol is the union of the typically, quote, male energy and, quote, female energy, positive energy, negative energy. All those are different ways of talking about a certain kind of duality. And when one transcends that duality, when one brings the yin and yang together, then you have a certain degree of integration and fusion. It is one particular level in that system, and that yin-yang system is also part of a perception that there's a certain energy that comes down through the cosmos that is differentiated, and one of those differentiations is the dualistic one in which the yin and yang is an expression of. So I don't want you to confuse the symbol that we had in the 60s with the actual metaphysical system, because the metaphysical system is much more
But I use that because people are more aware, they're aware of that, but it's beyond that. Brother Ronoko, black dwarf, China.
I think that probably what the first human, if we want to, I think, get a pretty good idea as to what the first human beings on this planet look like, I think what we're talking about are physically small black populations. In Central Africa, they are sometimes called Twa. In Cameroon, there's a group called the Baka. But in Asia, you also find these traditions, and sometimes the actual people themselves, in virtually every country. In China, you have a group referred to as black dwarfs. In Taiwan, there was a group called Little Black Man. You have in Southeast Asia, in northern Malaysia and southern Thailand, a group of people called Sakai. In the Philippines, you have black people called Agta. They are given the pejorative term negrito because that's what the Spanish called them. And even in Japan, the Ainu, who are early dwellers of Japan, claim that when they came there, they found a race of men living in holes in the ground. And supposedly they exterminated them with clubs. And Albert Churchward, the author of this book, Signs and Symbols of Primordial Men, among other things, talks about them and calls them Little Red Men. And so all over Asia, you have these traditions. And even if we were to go out of Asia, I would contend that the leprechaun, the wee folk in Ireland, are the offspring or the legendary representatives of these small black populations that I think peopled the entire world in ancient times, and certainly East Asia.
Yeah, well, you know, within all of the cultures that we have just covered, you know, even though in a sort of a broad, sweeping way, Dr. Bynum, transformation seems to be a very important element that runs through all of these cultures.
Well, certainly transformation as a principle of not only energy, but also as a principle of psychology is a very ancient one. The ancient Kemetic Egyptians, a cornerstone of their psychology was about the transformation of energies, the transformation of energies in the waking state, and the transformation of energies in the sleeping state, the transformation of energy when one dies and goes through the afterworld, the underworld. These are echoed later in the Tibetan Book of the Dead and many others. It's all about the transformation of energies. We shouldn't forget that it's only recently that science has come up with a mathematical formula for the transformation of energy from one state to another. E equals mc squared, Einstein's famous equation. Well, people have been actually experiencing and perceiving this dynamic transformation of energy from one condition, one state to another for millennia. And so this is only the E equals mc squared equation is only the last chapter, or I should say the most recent chapter in this. But the transformation of human consciousness, the evolution literally from more to more and more complex states is what many of the ancient psychologies are about. And they were very technical in the sense of being able to influence the physical world in addition to the psychological world.
You know, since we're talking about transformation, two things come to mind almost immediately, and what I like to refer to as symbolic logic. In all of these cultures that we have talked about so far, they have focused on elements within the environment, both animate and inanimate. And let's talk about the living things, for example. In India, the serpent is a very potent symbol used. In Egypt, of course, the vulture, the bird. Well, I guess I'm asking a rhetorical question. Well, what is the significance of the appearance, particularly of the serpent and the bird in all of the cultures that we talk about?
Well, from my perspective, one of the significances of the serpent is that it is purely from an evolutionary point of view. One of our enemies in ancient times when we were primates was the serpent. before we moved into the savannas and we lived deeper in the forest, one of our great enemies was the serpent. He came into the tree.
Excellent.
So there's a certain degree of evolutionary survival symbolism associated with the serpent. But also later, as we became much freer, we moved into the savannas and began to create civilization, we began to make observations in the natural world. The serpent was one of the few creatures that both lived above the earth and below the earth. Very symbolic. And also the serpent would shed its skin. It would transform. And also we must remember that the serpent attached to every male's body, the male genitalia, is associated with generativity. And so all of these came together and was a natural image and symbol for the human mind, a natural archetype, if you will, of the serpent. I think the same with the bird. The bird flies. The bird moves. But when we sleep at night, we fly. We move. And so I think those two are very simple but very clear examples of how phenomena in the natural world were observed, translated, and came into our direct experience as symbols of transformation in the world.
And you know, a lot of people have argued. I've given presentations on Egypt, and you know, I always show a lot of visuals. And sometimes people, without really thinking, will say, well, the Egyptians worshipped animals.
Right. I was coming to that point.
And I don't think anything could be further from the truth.
Right.
But certainly they did esteem certain attributes in the world of nature.
Yes.
And I think we can see that in the Medu Neter, in the ancient writing system of Egypt in particular.
But why don't you expound on one of them? Could I give you one that I'd like you to talk about? What about Horus, the falcon? I mean, the falcon headed god is represented. His representation of the pharaoh.
Well, you know, that's interesting because sometimes you seem to identify Horus or Heru in the form of a falcon, and other people identify him in the form of a hawk. And I think that
they belong to the same family, the
they
vulture
do.
family. Yeah.
I think Egypt or Kemet having a relatively cloudless sky, sometimes the hawk is identified too with the noonday sun, and Heru being the personification of that, or Ra Harakte.
Right.
Dr. Bynum, I'm sure you have some comments on that.
Well, my association from psychology is that the symbol of the Horus is of that part of us that can take flight, that can move literally through the air. You know, in our physical waking state, we walk, we move. When we are in a sleeping state or a dreaming state, that part of the psyche has the experience and the perception of movement, of flight. And if you're aware of the phenomenon of lucid dreaming, being aware of when you are dreaming, even when you are asleep, many people learn how to enter into that state, and in that state, many of the symbols are of flight, of taking flight, of being able to move through. If you're aware of some of the esoteric healing traditions, very often the healer, the shaman, or the other healer will be able to enter into the world of the person who is afflicted, and in that world, take flight with them. So these are some of the symbols that are associated with healing.
And you know, in addition to that, it's interesting. You know, I love Australia because the black people there have been there so long. They told me they've been there 120,000 years. And then India is important to me because it has such a huge black population. But in Australia, I went there and I had a chance to spend a lot of time with Aboriginal people. And I would ask them the question consistently, because I've been asked to pose this question, do you think people turn into animals? And without hesitation, they all answered yes. I think we're talking about some really deep and ancient concepts that the Western world has really not quite come to grips with yet, and tends to distort and have a false perception of.
Right.
Yeah. You know, we don't have a lot of time, but I want both of you to respond to the Syrian drama, because within this drama, there's a lot of things that has to do with psychology and spirituality.
Yes,
Please,
absolutely.
just take a shot anywhere you wish.
I'll be brief.
Okay.
I'll be brief. I think the Osirian drama is the greatest story ever told. It's a love story. It's a story of resurrection. It's a story of truth triumphing over evil.
Right.
And it is an African story that personifies a lot of the most profound concepts that go back to ancient Africa. And we see, of course, a lot of it today within the realm of Christianity.
Right.
I absolutely agree, And from an historical point of view, it's very interesting to note that the rise of the religion, the cult of Osiris in Egypt, precedes by very few years a rise of civilization in Egypt as we know it. because one of the principles Osiris taught was that the body of a dead person, dead man, was a sacred thing, not to be destroyed, burnt, devoured. And why? Because from this body would, in the future, emerge the resplendent soul, spirit of the new being. The notion of resurrection, and this occurs at the very dawn of civilization as we know it at the present time.
Yeah, you know, I wanna make a punctuation and then have both of you respond to it. I think since Egypt has received so much acclaim because there's so much information about this culture, we sometimes neglect, you know, the civilizations that preceded them, as Nubia and Ethiopia. Could you just say what you wish about those?
I was mentioning earlier that I had interacted a couple months ago with the Sudanese community in Kansas City, a lot of them over there. And the head of the community was a brother named James Tellar from the Deep South. And he used an expression I never heard before, and that was Nile Valley Pool. I never heard that before.
Right. I like that too.
He said that in ancient times there was a body or a pool of civilizations, and from that, or a pool, and from that pool flowed streams of civilizations, of which Egypt of the Pharaohs or Kemet was certainly the most spectacular one, but definitely not the only one.
From my point of view, I don't completely separate Egypt from the civilization of Nubia. For me, that's Egypto-Nubian civilization. The idea of, quote, Egyptian civilization, unquote, actually arose by European scholars when they first thought that they would study Egyptian civilization and find Europeans there. Because they knew in Nubia there were no Europeans. So it became, study Egyptian civilization. But it's actually Egypto-Nubian civilization is the root civilization of our worldwide dispersal of civilization today.
And of course you have the kingdom of Tasseti. You have Meroe, Wawa, the land of Yam, Cush, and many others.
But guess what? Time waits on no man.
I'm not surprised.
And our time has expired. I have thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with you. I'm sure people in the audience would like to hear much more from both of you. Professor Ronoko Rashidi, your book is
The African Presence in Early Asia.
And it is a great book.
And your book, too?
The African Unconscious.
And it is a great book.
This has been Sankofa Review. God bless you. See you next time. Keep listening and watching, people.
Hotel.
Welcome to another edition of Sankofa Review. I'm your host, Crawford. We're on location today in Medgar College, and our guests today are Professor Ronoko Rashidi and Dr. Bruce Bynum. Welcome to you both again.
Hotel.
Now, in our last conversation, we stopped at a very important point, and we began to talk about the Assyrian drama. Who wants to begin this conversation around this narrative?
The Osirian drama is sometimes called a passion play.
Okay.
And there are several major characters. You have the first, and the major figure is Asar, better known to us by the Greek rendition Osiris. And Osiris is regarded, some people say that there's a story that says, on the first day a loud voice called out unto the world that the king of all has come. And that was Asar, or Osiris. And he is something of a prince. He's, to me, the prototype of the gentleman. He's the good guy. He comes and he helps introduce civilization into the world. And then on the next day, there's another man named Horus, or Heru the Elder, sometimes identified with the noonday sun. And then on the third day, a man named Set, or Sut. And Set and Asar, or Osiris, are the major protagonists. It's kind of like a duality here, a conflict between good and evil, light and darkness. And then you finally have a woman who figures into it, and her name is Aset. I like the African names because they symbolize deep things. Aset means the throne, but of course she is more popularly known as Isis.
And then the Madonna.
Exactly. And then Neptet. And Neptet marries Set, and Aset marries Osiris. And eventually, Osiris, after he civilizes Egypt, he goes out into the rest of Asia and he introduces civilization. But he doesn't bring an army with him. In fact, I think he has a flute. And he takes his chief lieutenant, Tahuti, And they introduced civilization into Asia. And Osiris is such a classical good guy that he doesn't have to bring an army. Everybody wants to emulate his behavior. And while he's gone, an intrigue sets in. He names his wife Aset as regent of Egypt, and Set becomes very jealous. And he plans to do his brother in. And when Asar comes back, he has a big party in which Osiris is murdered.
Right.
But the most profound part of the story to me is that Aset, through her love of her husband, follows the body. It's encased in a chest. It floats down the Nile. It goes to another country. Aset goes and gets the body and somehow manages to restore it to life. So we have a resurrected savior.
Right.
And he's castrated also. Set castrates him. And somehow they're able to produce a child.
Right.
So you have a virgin birth. And that child is Heru, better known as Horus. Heru is the original hero. And he eventually grows up. He defeats Set. And he reclaims his father's inheritance so that the king of Egypt becomes known as the living Heru, the living god.
Right, right.
And when the king is deceased, he becomes as one with Osiris. This is a very deep story. And it permeates a lot of what we know about modern religion today.
Dr. Bynum, this Osirian drama, as we know it, there are several versions of it.
Yes.
And I know that you could bring to bear upon this conversation another version of it.
Yeah, there are many versions, and it does involve, as you pointed out, the same characters.
Right.
So the same characters, deep archetypal figures that are very meaningful in our collective psychology. And many of the variations on this Osirian drama were actually painted on the tombs of the pharaohs and later on the Greeks and Romans. But one of the more popular ones was written by the author Plutarch. And in this story are the same characters, except that Osiris, after civilizing various parts of Egypt, enthrones his wife, civilizes the world, comes back, and is betrayed. And this occurs, interestingly enough, at a banquet. And by a ruse, he's got to get into a
Chest.
chest. And at that point,
He was the only person who could have fit in that
the
chest.
only
the whole
person
banquet.
fit by Set,
Right.
and he is tricked into this, sent down the river to another country.
Right.
His wife does follow, eventually finds him, liberates him. He's been killed and murdered, his body dismembered. And his body's not only been, recollects his body's brought back, brought back to life. He's killed again. His body is dismembered into 13 pieces scattered around Egypt.
Right.
Those areas become sacred sites in Egypt, and the area that is missing is the phallus. It's interesting to note that this symbolism was very important. That was very important to the founding fathers of the American Revolution, because there were 13 colonies, and they united these 13 colonies. If you look on a dollar bill, all these figures on the dollar
13
bill,
stars,
13
arrows,
13 arrows.
13 branches.
Where are there any pyramids outside of Egypt and Nubia? No, they're only there. There's the all-seeing eye, the capstone. I mean, many of these are in the deep unconscious of the American people, the American Republic. And that's one of the things I think we need to bring, this Osirian saga that initiates civilization as we know it today.
And
go ahead.
you know, too, we talked about this earlier. When we look at some of the principal figures, in this case, Heru, the infant, who grows to manhood, and his mother, Aset, we can see a modern variation of them, I think, in Jesus and Mary. And it has been argued that many people, when Christians went out and tried to convert the rest of the world, these faiths, these beliefs were so deeply rooted that instead of trying to destroy them, they merely adapted them. And we see a lot of them in major religions today.
But in India, for example, we see an extension of this story. Could you tell us that story there?
Well, I just see certain similarities. For example, in India, you have a figure named Krishna. Krishna is always identified as black. It is said that Krishna was 33 years old when he was assassinated, that he too was born of a virgin. His mother's name was Devaki, that he becomes a resurrected savior. And then you also see this I don't say worship of the lingam or phallic symbol, but something very close to it. And that is connected with a deity named Shiva.
Right.
And throughout the major temples of India, you see a black phallic symbol. And it is more or less worshipped or close to it. And India, of course, is important to me because it has such a huge black population, including a lot of the people called tribals and many of the people called untouchables,
Right, right.
who are the most oppressed people in the world.
Tell us some more about these people, because I don't think that a lot of people in the audience are
I think that
quite
they
familiar.
are the offspring of the most ancient populations that went into India. And of course, we talked about the Indus Valley civilization previously. And you have to ask what happened. In fact, people ask that question all the time, that if black people, if African people did all these great things, what happened? Well, one of the things that happened around the middle of the second millennium BC, about 1500 BC, is you have a whole series of migrations. Some of them impacted Kemet, or Egypt, and they're called the Hyksos. And then you have others that go into Europe. They're called Dorians, among other things, and the Kassites in Western Asia. But in India, you have linguistically a group called Indo-Europeans, and culturally they're known as Aryans. These are essentially white people, nomadic white folks who invaded India and who introduced what became a color-coded social order called the caste system.
Right.
And at the bottom of the caste system are the masses of conquered black people called Sudras, and outside of the caste system are the people known as outcasts or untouchables. Now, untouchables are not a racial group. They are, I would say, a social-economic group, but of which a significant portion of them are black. There are more untouchables in India today than the combined populations of England, France, Belgium, and Spain. And they're the most oppressed people in the world, I think. And the term untouchable is so profound because it implies that the very touch of these people is considered polluting or contaminating to the higher echelons in society.
Okay. Dr. Bynum, arising out of this same drama, we now have a discipline to which you have some affinity and some affinity with. It's called psychology. What are some of the ingredients in the Assyrian drama that lend itself to what is now called modern psychology?
There are a number. One of the most direct is the notion of the transformation of one's life and one's consciousness. This is clearly throughout the different tellings of the story, a theme that gets repeated. Another repeating theme is the conflict between family members, issues of loyalty, betrayal, transcendence, love that seems to know no bounds. All these deep family-related themes are in the Assyrian drama. And then beyond that, there's the themes of not only transformation, but the transcendence of one's condition and the entering into a new life. Remember, Osiris begins, as you pointed out earlier, in a great announcement. It's like a great star falls from the heavens to earth. Literally, light falls into the trap of matter. And his saga is the liberation of the self, or that life, back into the light from which it originally came. And I think that that's a profound metaphor for the transformation of not only human consciousness, but the transformation of ourselves as a species. Because at one time, we were a very primitive species. Now we're on the threshold of recognizing ourselves as infinitely more, as literally beings of light. And we are on the cusp of that at this particular point. It's another level of transformation.
No, in line with transformation, we see in Nile Valley cultures again, coming out of the so-called mystery systems. Europeans call it mystery because they didn't understand them. But for example, at the temple of Luxor, students, neophytes attended, and they engaged in the 7 liberal arts. And one of those liberal arts was learning to ascend above one's human material, animal nature. Could you talk about that?
Well, in the mystery schools, as I understand, there were 3 levels of initiation. Those who had just come in,
the neophytes,
those who had been studying for a long period of time, and those who had transcended, or the sons of light.
Right.
The Christ who studied was a son of light. The greatest book of the ancient world is the Kemetic Egyptian book of the so-called Book of the Dead, the Papyrus of Ani, also translated as the coming forth by day, the going forth by night. This is about the psychological and the psychospiritual transformation of the human psychology from one of a being encapsulated in his body, bound by the earth, to one who recognizes himself ultimately to be a being of spirit and ultimately be a being of light. The transformation of consciousness through different realms and different disciplines and different techniques. It's a scientific, it's a methodology, and it is at the very core of psychology. In fact, many of the words and many of the concepts of modern psychology are rooted in these ancient traditions. Carl Jung develops the idea of anima and animus from the study of West African psychologies. It was originally presented in a book called, quote, Primitive Culture, unquote, by Taylor, but the idea of the anima and the animus is rooted here. Jung got his concept of the archetypes from a North African philosopher, St. Augustine, in Principiis. The notion of the unconscious, the ancient Egyptians referred to the unconscious as the primeval waters of Nun and the Amen-Ta. They had a concept for the unconscious, and they use it in medicine, in hypnosis, and in their psychospiritual traditions. And so the psychology that we study today, even the words that we use, psychology, psyche, the Greek for she spirit, comes from the ancient Kemetic Egyptian.
Ronoko, in terms of the archetypes in ancient Indus Valley cultures, before let's go back a little before the invasion, the 1500 BC invasion by Aryans. Could you talk to us about what sort of spiritual practice?
Well, again, it's difficult to say. I think that when you go to India, and I've had a chance to go there 3 times now, I've been very fortunate. In the last 2 trips, I've had a chance to interact with people commonly called Adivasis, or the tribal people. I know that in the state of Orissa, where you have 62 designated tribal groups, among the groups that I've seen, the female is very important. In fact, I was able, yes. Or I like to use the word matrifocal, where the emphasis is on the female. I guess the word matriarchal is taking on kind of a life of itself, like the word primitive, with the basis of which is the word prime.
First.
They seem to worship God in the form of a black woman. Now that's very deep, and it certainly predates the Aryan invasion of India. And these people seem to be very secure in terms of acknowledging the significance of women, even going back to the Osirian drama. I contend that while Osiris is the most popular, or he's the most recognized figure in the drama, that Aset is really the heroine of the drama. She's the one who goes to get the body. And through her intervention, life is restored back to Osiris. India is no exception in that case.
Well, it's the black female Madonna you find distributed all over the world.
And even Kali in India.
Yes, Kali in India. You find the black Madonna in Mexico. You find her in Poland. You find her in Germany. You find her in France. Paris, the site of Paris, was once a temple of Isis, Isis. This is where Paris began.
Of course.
So throughout the world, you find the symbol. My own sense is that she's a representation not only of that first in the mythology of Osiris, the story of Osiris, but also approximately 150,000 or so years ago, all of our gene pools crossed in one woman on the African savannas, the so-called mitochondrial DNA mother of humanity. I think there's a deep collective unconscious memory of her that gets projected out and remembered in the black Madonnas throughout the world as a source of generativity, as the common mother, as the primal root of our species.
Since we're talking about some of these archetypal figures, I want to bring us more into a more contemporary vein. And in our last conversation, you just mentioned the word shaman. And shaman is the medicine man, the psychologist of his community.
Yes.
Could you expound upon that a little more for me?
Well, the shamans of our community are our psychologists, psychiatrists, clinical social workers, and so forth. And what we do is we enter into, hopefully, the world of the person we are helping, we're treating, and we deal with the, quote, demons of their world, unquote. Now, we don't think of them in demon terms of the way that others may think of them in terms of personifying these forces. We think of them in terms of biochemical phenomena. We think of them in terms of unconscious dynamics and the kind. It is the same process. We're using different labels, and we tend to be pejorative when we talk about other people's, because we say they are, quote, dealing with demons.
Yeah.
Someone who is experiencing a major affective disorder is dealing with a demon of a certain kind. They're not personifying it very much in that sense, but they are dealing with those phenomena. It is the same system, the same healer, and they enter into the world of the other. They become engaged through the process of empathy. They must know this person's world system, this person's assumptive world, and the dynamics that follow from it, and they are working with the person's deep unconscious in a transformative kind of way, working through their defenses in a healing capacity, hopefully.
Now, you speak so eloquently about, not only eloquently, but quite informatively about the shaman and about the whole genesis of psychology. Your work is?
The work is in the area of psychology, particularly
I was talking about your book, which deals with this.
Oh, the African unconscious.
Okay.
Yes. One of the things I try to do in the African unconscious is demonstrate absolutely clearly that all of humanity is not only rooted in Africa, but that the deep unconscious of everyone, from Europe, Asia, throughout Africa, South America, that the deep level of the shared psyche of everyone has an ancestral African root. The collective unconscious is really the African unconscious. And that notion is in deep repression in many parts of the world because the dark people have confused with black.
Right.
And black is not dark.
Right.
And the symbols of blackness are radically different. But that all human beings are really deep down in their core variations of a great African species. And that the African is the template in the deep psyche of that. And that will appear in our dreams, that will appear in our unconscious, and that will appear in our behavior if the repression is there. There's a quote myth in ancient Egypt, in Greece, and that is the myth of the devouring Sphinx. And I think it's a very important myth because in that myth, in that system, the heroes would go to the devouring Sphinx and with a question about their identity, of who they were. And if they answered wrong, the Sphinx would devour them. Well, there are no sphinxes in Greece.
Right.
That's an Egyptian. It is I contend that is a threatened return of the repressed. That Africoid consciousness in much of the modern world is feared. It is a threatened return of the repressed.
Brother Ronoko, rectenu, know thyself.
You know, that's very controversial. And I know one prominent African scholar has gone on record as saying that on every Egyptian temple, you would find the words "know thyself." And I talked to him, and it's okay, I guess, to have differences of opinion and come to different conclusions. But I talked to another African scholar who told me that who reads the Medu Neter, the hieroglyphics, told me he's not been able to find that. Some people argue that this concept is deeply rooted in ancient Kemet, whereas other people find it in ancient Greece. I think that these kinds of programs and what we are involved in right now shows that this thing that we're doing is very live, is very dynamic, that we're always coming across new information. And here, we are talking about another African, not the African that we grew up with in the jungle with a spear, mostly in a Hollywood movie, but rather an African who laid the basis for religion, for spirituality, for science itself, for civilization itself. And I think that is the African that we are chasing right now, that we're trying to come to grips with.
Dr. Bynum, you know, people are fascinated by the Sphinx, and there are quite a number of descriptions about what the Sphinx really means. You know, one common one that comes across in a lot of literature is that the anthropomorphic image, which means part man and part animal, and the part animal represent that of the feline. The feline in this instance is supposed to be representing the suppression of our animal nature. As a psychologist, what are your reflections?
Well, that's an interesting idea, and you could run with it, but I don't know.
I
if
wouldn't.
you could,
that's why I'm coming to you.
But I don't think you could definitely prove it one way or the other.
Okay.
But what I do think is very important is the Sphinx apparently was not built by Khephren.
Right.
A few thousand years before
I know,
Christ.
but rather,
I know, but rather the Sphinx is through archaeoastronomy is apparently seems to have been built about 10,500 years.
Yeah.
and he's looking due east on the vernal equinox into the constellation of Leo, which indicates that there is a system, a zodiacal system, which I don't completely understand, that has been in place for a long, long period of time. We have water erosion marks at the base of the Sphinx, indicating that this occurred when the area was lush. The area has been desert for thousands of years. It was lush between 10 and 12,000 years ago. And I know that's controversial, but it indicates that the roots of civilization go further and further and further back than we know, including the cults of Osiris and the cults of Horus. Horus may have actually been a movement associated with the manufacture of iron that eventually emerged out of the middle of Africa thousands of years ago.
Let me say three brief things on that. Number one is I think that if we look at it, we will find that Set is actually much older than Heru and Osiris, and that all of these characters became incorporated in what is called the Osirian drama. That's one thing. Number two, I agree with you. I think that the so-called Sphinx is much older than the Fourth Dynasty, and I don't have any problem with that. But I think, too, that certainly Khafre, or Khephren as he is known by the Greeks, certainly must have worked on it. Or restored it.
Well, it's been restored many times.
Even during the time of Tutmosis IV, you know, the story where he had the dream and he fell asleep between the Sphinx's paws, and the Sphinx said, if you remove the sand from around me, I will make you king of Egypt. So this story of the Sphinx permeates a lot of aspects of Egyptian society, but I was not aware of those comments you made about the Greeks and how this devouring Sphinx figured into their mythology. And all of these things take us back to Africa. And I think it means that Africa must be re-examined from the beginning. What we are doing, in essence, is rewriting history based on the facts from the dawn of humankind. And that will give us a whole different perspective on Africa when we complete that.
Now, since we're talking about the Sphinx there, and the African word, the Hormacus, the avenue of the Sphinxes that leads one to the temple at Karnak, what was it? What took place there once a year?
Ceremonies took place there once a year, led by the pharaoh, to reacquaint those in power with the origins of the civilization, the mythos, the mythology. And by mythos, I don't mean false. I mean a different way of ordering knowledge and information. And it was to reaffirm that this is where we come from and this is where we are going.
And I suspect that avenue of Sphinxes actually probably connected what is called Luxor Temple today with Karnak Temple. And if you go to Egypt today, the connection is not there, but in antiquity, I suspect it must have been. And of course, this is on the east bank of the Nile, and the mortuary temples and the tombs are on the west bank of the Nile, the city of the living and the city of the dead.
You know, what I find quite interesting about that procession is a number of different things that are explicitly African. That A, it was a celebration. That B, there were standard bearers to the extent of what we would call a float today. That C, people wore masks, and that D, there was a definite leader to that, and so I see that as one of the ways, one of the arguments that we use to connect Nile Valley cultures, more specifically Kemet, to the interior of Africa, where we find the Igungun masquerade, Geledi, and all those masquerades. Do you want
there's sufficient archaeological support and also ancient traditions to strongly indicate that the Egyptian civilization, the Nubian civilization, was a wave emerging out of the center of Africa. And that is a radical contradictory notion. It turns history on its head, because for the last several hundred years we have been indoctrinated and taught just the opposite. But in the ancient traditions and myths around the world, and in terms of ancient civilizations, we find references to that kind of phenomenon.
You know who used to have a nice way of expressing that was Gerald Massey. In his book, Ancient Egypt, Light of the World, he used to say, Africa, the birthplace, and Egypt, the mouthpiece.
Right. Brother Ronoko, I want you to tell my listening audience, viewing audience as well, about this, your last work.
Well, my most recent work and my most comprehensive work. It's called the African Presence in Early Asia, co-edited with Ivy Van Sertima. It's the most comprehensive book of its type in the world, and I'm very proud of it.
Okay, Dr. Bynum,
Mine is called The African Unconscious, roots of ancient mysticism and modern psychology, an exploration of the template of the deep unconscious being an African phenomenon, and also the roots of psychology itself and its transformative traditions.
Now, we get 2 minutes left. I want you to leave my audience with some very definitive words of wisdom.
When I give a presentation or even a television interview,
Right.
I always try to do 3 things. I say it over and over again. Number 1 is to present the information itself. That's easy. Number 2, I want to engage people in critical thinking and deep analysis. That's a little harder. We're not here to speak for popularity.
No.
And 3, I try to inspire people so that when you turn off the TV or when you leave the lecture hall, you feel a greater sense of duty and obligation to take this information and do something positive with it.
Offer something that is life-affirming, reaffirming too.
What I would offer is that humanity, all the 5 tribes of humanity are basically one, and they are all children of the African womb, regardless of surface phenotypical adaptations. We are in our deep core the same being, the same creature, with the same aspirations, and that is to recognize ourselves, our origins, and to recognize our trajectory in the stars.
Where could someone get into contact with you if they wanted to?
I'm at the University of Massachusetts Health Services in Amherst, Massachusetts.
Do you have an email address, a telephone number you want to share with this audience?
Yes, www.ebbynum@uhs.umass.edu.
I hope they remember. Ronoko?
But the easiest thing is just the University of Massachusetts at Amherst.
Anybody that wants to get in touch with me, the simplest thing is to call me at 210-648-5178. That's 210-648-5178.
You know, I can't begin to thank both of you for spending this time with me. I'm deeply touched and quite humbled by having the opportunity to learn from both of you, and I'm sure this is the same sentiment that my audience shares.
We share it with you.
I appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure, brother.
This has been Sankofa Review. God bless you. See you next time, people. Take care.
Blessings and greetings. I am Yamla Van Sant. Your history is more than just a story about where you've been. It is an indication of just how far you can go. At Medgar Evers College, we have a powerful history of a powerful man that has given us a tradition of excellence which we can take into the future. If you've been thinking about going back to school or just want to investigate the possibilities for the future, I invite you to come to Medgar Evers College, where the excellent faculty and the dedicated and committed staff and the student commitment to excellence are the tools that will help you build a better future. Come to Medgar Evers.